Hello and welcome to another episode of Just Roll With It, where today I wanted to take a moment to explain in a little bit more detail the 3 C's system that we talk about at the end of our reviews. Specifically, it's not intended to be a review or a score or a ranking in terms of how much we liked a game. It is supposed to be an objective set of 3 items that we use to help determine if a game is right for you or wrong for you. The 3 C's stand for complexity, comprehension, and consideration. And again, these are going to be scored from 1 to 5 in each of our videos. Now, in the description of the videos, we will have a text description of each one of these, a paragraph for each of the 3, and a link to this video, which maybe is how you got here to begin with. But the idea behind it is for it to be an objective sort of metric in determining whether a game is right for you and your group. So complexity is going to represent the overall number of mechanics and different things in the game. So you could maybe call that similar to something like a weight, right? Some games are heavier, some games are lighter. It's not entirely that, but that'd be a similar thing that you could compare it to. Comprehension is going to be more about like the rules and how easy it is to teach, how easy it is to, if you don't play the game for 3 months and then you take it off the shelf, are you going to have to reread that rule book from start to finish in order to even remember how to play the game? Or is the game laid out in such an intuitive way so that you can just sort of pick it up again and maybe reference the rule book a couple of times, but very easily get that back. I mean, that'd be something that would be lower in comprehension. You're able to comprehend it more quickly, you're able to understand it, teach it to people. And then last but not least, we have consideration. Consideration is going to be mostly turn to turn, how long it takes you to, how many different options you have available to you. If you have all sorts of different options and things, you could call this something like analysis paralysis. Sometimes people call it that, where there's just so many different options and strategies that you can go for on your turn that it can maybe become overwhelming. So that would be something that would be high consideration, because you're having to do a lot of considering on your turn of what you're going to do. So that's the short version of what the 3 C's stand for. But I think in order to better give examples of what would score high and what would score low in these different categories is to give 3 examples, 3 high and 3 low of each one. So we'll start with complexity and we'll move on from there, but we'll give 3 examples that'll be high, 3 examples that'll be low. Should be noted, we're not giving a score for these. We're just, above 2.5, below 2.5, that sort of thing. So high and low. Without further ado, let's get to the examples for complexity. Alright, so starting out, we're going to start with our high complexity games. So first off here, we have Through the Ages, which is a civilization game. The reason this is going to be falling under high complexity is because, well, if you're familiar with the game at all, have either played it or familiar with other Vlaada Chvátil games, I hope I'm saying his name right, he usually has a lot of mechanics, a lot of things that you're tracking, trying to cover in your turns. Specifically in this one, there's all sorts of buildings that you can build for science and agriculture and mining, as well as militaries, and then your military tactics stay with you for a turn, and then they go for everybody else, and there's all these tracks that you're trying to move up to, and then you have to spend those things in order to research things, in order to build your civilization, and there's different ages, and there's all these effects and phases, and oh my goodness, it's a complicated game. There's just a lot going on, it's difficult to teach, there's so many different mechanics. You're moving cubes around in order to build your mines and things. So overall, I don't think it's a very controversial opinion that this would be considered a high complexity game. Moving on to our second game here, we have another one that's pretty widely considered high complexity, and that is Twilight Imperium. This is 3rd edition that I own, but you can pretty much put any edition that exists. This is a giant, long space 4X game where you're exploring, exploiting, expanding, and exterminating. You have a whole giant fleet of plastic ships that you can build and manufacture. You have planets you can explore, you have political stuff, you have the action selection system from games like Puerto Rico, where or like Mission Red Planet, where you're choosing one action and then everybody else gets to do the lesser version of that action. You've got politics, where you're working with other civilizations and trying to make peace treaties and things with them, as well as you have this whole stack of cards that's like your tech tree, and certain techs require other techs. And so there's all sorts of mechanics at play here. It's a huge, sprawling, massive game. And on top of all of that, if you play within the expansions or even in the base game, there are additional modules you can throw in, which even up the complexity over what you already have, as it's more rules that you're adding in. So this is a great example of a very high complexity game. So then on to our third example of our high complexity games, we have Spirit Island. Again, if you're at all familiar with Spirit Island, I don't think you disagree that this is a very heavy game. Not only are you managing the invaders and the island and where the Dahan are, the villagers on the island, where your presence is, where your other player presence is, you're trying to juggle all of that. You're trying to stop invaders from going certain spaces. You're trying to manage your own spirit board, so you have your own powers that you start with, your own play style. You're better at certain things. You're leveling up your spirit. You're managing your cards. You're choosing when to get your cards back and when to, play what you've got. You're trying to generate fear in order to scare the invaders. There's a whole programmatic side to it with the way that the invaders multiply in the spaces that they are. There's just a lot going on, which definitely makes this a high complexity game. This isn't just like a straight deck builder or something like that, right? That would be something that's lower complexity. This is a lot of mechanics, a lot of things going on, and it's certainly a little bit, especially like the card effects and things, it takes a little bit to wrap your head around. So that's 3 examples of high complexity games. But let's go ahead and look at some lower complexity games. So lower on the complexity scale of the 3 C's would be something like Sushi Go. This would be what I would call like a pure game, right? Where it's just a single mechanic. It's not a bunch of different mechanics. It's just drafting. So you're essentially divvying out all the cards into equal piles for all the players, and then you're passing them around. You're choosing one to put in front of you, and you're passing the others, and they all have different scoring conditions, and you're basically just trying to draft cards that are better for you and not so good for your opponent, in order to score as many points as possible. It's a very pure game. There's only really one true mechanic to it, which is just the drafting. So that makes it a lower complexity game. Probably one of the lowest complexity games. Then we also, in the low complexity category, we have Codenames. From a mechanical standpoint, this is a very interesting game, and we'll come back to this one later in another of the 3 C's. This game is a 5x5 grid of word cards. They each have a single word on them. And then you're splitting into 2 teams, and each team is going to have a spy master. And your spy master needs to come up with a clue, which is a word that isn't on the table, and then a number of things that clue relates to, of the cards that are the word cards that are out on the table. And the tricky part is you only want your team to guess the blue colored agents, and you only want you want them to guess as many as possible. And the goal is just to get all of your agents revealed on the field as the blue team or the red team before the opponent does. Now, there's one space on the board that's the assassin, and if anyone flips that one over, then the team that causes it to be flipped over loses the game. There's also innocent bystanders. You can even, if your team is really bad at guessing, or if you're not careful as the spy master, you can allow the opponent points by accidentally having your team guess a location of a card that isn't yours, but it's actually the opponent's agent, and so then they get a point, essentially. It's a very good game, but in terms of complexity, what's happening here is very simple. It's a 5x5 grid of cards. There's really only the one mechanic, which is the spy masters giving clues, and your team trying to interpret your clue to the best of their ability and score points, and the first one to get all of their agents revealed wins. So not a lot of different mechanics here. It's just a very basic, nice and clean game. And I'll mention it now in case I forget, but just to reiterate, lower or higher on any of the 3 C's is not a good or a bad thing. This is not a review. This is specifically a metric to help people decide if you like less complex games, then a game that we score lower on the complexity scale is probably more right for you than one that's, 5 on the complexity scale. So it's really just to help you determine if a game is good for you or your group. And then our final example of a low complexity game is we have Splendor. This is still one of my favorite games from when I first got into the hobby. This is an oldie but a goodie. But essentially what you're doing is there will be a big old offering of 3 different tiers of cards, and they'll have, sometimes they'll always have gems in the corners, but sometimes they'll have victory points if they're level 2 or level 3 of the 3 tiers. But when you're starting out, you're going to be basically on your turn, you're going to either be taking different colored gems or using those gems that you've taken in previous turns to purchase cards. And then those cards essentially give you like permanent gems that you don't have to spend. They're just printed on the cards, so you always get to keep them. And so you're basically just trying to do that and get to the, I forget exactly how many victory points you need. It's been a little while since I played. I think it's like 15 or something. But once you get to that, then you win the game. Simple as that. You're basically taking gems, using those gems to buy cards, and using those cards to get victory points and more gems. So there's not a lot to it. Very simple in terms of complexity. There's not a lot of different mechanics going on, and that's what makes this lower on the complexity scale. So hopefully that helped, better illustrate what it is, what we mean when we say that a game is low in terms of complexity. Let's move on to comprehension. All right, so moving on to the second of the 3 C's, which is comprehension, we have Gloomhaven, or in this case, just the lid, because it's a little unwieldy to drag on and off screen. Shouldn't really come as a surprise to anyone. Gloomhaven is a very dense game. There's a lot going on. It takes a while to comprehend exactly what's going on in this game down to a T. So you have the basics, which are, play 2 cards, one for its initiative, and then you do the top action of one and the bottom action of another, and you're essentially dungeon crawling and more or less just solving a puzzle with the enemies and things that are laid out in front of you in the scenario book. Fine. Not that complicated. Not that hard to comprehend. But when you get into trouble is that there's all these weird little interactions in the rulebook with how, certain things affect other things and how, rolling modifiers stack, and the rulebook isn't particularly well laid out, so it can take a while, many games likely, before you realize you're doing things wrong. I mean, there's whole people have made and published their own fan-made rule reference things because there's so many little rules that are easily missed or misinterpreted or just completely lost in the rule book for certain situations and how they interact. Hopefully Frosthaven does a better job of this and more clear, makes things a little bit cleaner with how they interact and function. But the basic version of Gloomhaven, we definitely played a lot of things wrong the first few times we played it. And it wasn't until we read some of those articles and things that people had published of things that are easily missed or done incorrectly that we realized, at this point, I think we're mostly playing it right, but we're on scenario 60, so it's hard to say. But at the end of the day, that definitely lends itself. It's going to be hard to fully comprehend the game. You may think you understand the basics in Gloomhaven the first time you play it, but fully comprehending all of the rules and the intricacies of those rules is something that's going to take a while. And so what we always like to say with comprehension is it has a lot to do with rulebooks. It has a lot to do with how the information is presented to you, both in the rulebook and in the game, which we'll talk about when we get to the low section. I have an example of how a game can be a little bit heavier, but actually present the information in such a way that it just makes sense and you're not having to go back and reference things and look in the rulebook. The game is designed in such a way that the design language of the game is done in such a way that it just makes sense. So that's our first example of a high comprehension game. Our next one is going to be Robinson Crusoe, which is a cooperative game. I guess Gloomhaven was as well, but specifically in Robinson Crusoe, you could say this is relatively high complexity, if you wanted to talk about that, but it is definitely high comprehension. This is one where I personally feel the rulebook is one of the worst I've ever read. It's laid out in such a way that really doesn't make that sense. They talk about and reference things earlier in the rulebook that they have not even introduced you to at that point in the rulebook, and it's not until like the end or middle of the rulebook that you're introduced to these things that they're referencing and talking about earlier. There's weird timing effects, so there's certain phases where you can spend things and do things, and there's certain phases where you can't. Another thing that really helps with games that are higher comprehension, but they can lower that number a little bit, would be things like player aids or rules references. Fantasy Flight doesn't always do everything perfect, but one of the things I really appreciate in a lot of their games is they will do a learn to play rulebook, which gives you the very basics and will leave out some of the more, the keywords and the more niche things. You go through the learn to play, you play the first few turns of the game, boom, you get it, and then you have the rule reference, which has a glossary and it's alphabetized, and then you can just look up whatever the keyword is, boom, go to page 3, open it up, read whatever's there. You don't have to be flipping around in the rule book back and forth and trying to find, something in a 60-page rulebook that's super hard to find. So that is a way that people can lower their comprehension, as well as really good player aids that list like a round sequence, maybe, different things that you can do on your turn, different actions that are available. Those help a ton. This game has some of that, but I'd argue that a lot of it is really poorly executed on. Now, I know that there's a slightly newer version of this that was on Kickstarter a while ago that had just ridiculous Kickstarter bloat with miniatures and things, but maybe they fixed the rulebook a little bit in that one, but I have this version, and the rulebook is a slog every single time I've had to go through it. And there's no easy way to reference things. Like I said, the game is heavier, but it's not exceptionally heavy. It's not heavier than some of the other games that we have on here. And the fact that I feel like I need to read the rulebook every single time shows that I don't truly comprehend the game with all those little idiosyncrasies and interactions. So it's another high comprehension game. Moving on to our third and final high comprehension game, we have Mage Knight. Once again, widely accepted to be a very heavy game, very complex game, but it's also going to be a game that requires high comprehension. And I think that's true. This is the second Vlada game that we've had on here. We also had Through the Ages and Codenames. Sorry, this is the third. But I love his games. I own a lot of them. I really enjoy them. But I will say they tend to be on the crunchier side in terms of rules. There's usually a lot of different effects and things that are interacting. Specifically with Mage Knight, you have your cards in your deck, which are relatively straightforward in how you play them. You can play them sideways for one of most things, or you can play them for their abilities, and if you activate the thing on them with magic, then you get the extra magical ability. That's pretty straightforward. But where it gets really complex is in all the interactions of the pieces. So you have all kinds of different enemy types on the board, and they all have specific rules about how you interact with them. Some of them are placed face up so you can see what they are. Some of them are placed face down, and depending on the time of day, because the game is played in rounds that are a day and then a night. And there's also, on top of all the enemies, there's all these locations on the board that all do very specific things when you interact with them. You can interact with them in different ways. Like monasteries, you can choose to interact with them and trade with the monks, or you can just burn the monastery. I mean, there's all sorts of different things. It's very sandboxy in that regard, which is what makes the game appealing to a lot of people, but it's also very difficult to remember. If I have not played this, I have to reread the rules. And even more so when you're talking about combat, there's rules for combat in terms of, the main goal of the game is usually destroying a certain number of big cities that have a whole bunch of monsters. You have to fight them as a collective in a certain way. You defend against them in a certain way. There's different elemental attack types. So you have fire attacks, ice attacks, icy fire attacks, things like that, and all of that stuff is very difficult to remember, to track, to keep, to really wrap your head around. And so this is definitely very high on the comprehension scale. On top of that, there really isn't a good player reference. The rules are not very well laid out. They're pretty decent if you're learning to play the game for the first time, but if you're going back into the rulebook to reference something you don't remember, the two rulebooks are very confusingly laid out. and then you mix in expansions and things. And what I've had to do with this game is basically make like a 2-page printout that has like all the combat tables, what does reduce damage against what based on like the fire and ice, and other, niche like one-off things that like, oh, you can't do this when this, and this is only available when you do this, and this is when these things happen. And there's so many things like that in this game. Love the game, but I also understand people who don't like it, and I would say it's specifically because of that really high comprehension. Not only is it a complex game, but it's also incredibly high on the comprehension scale, which is something we should maybe note with our next one. So this is going to be our first lower comprehension game. Games that are a little bit easier. And this one is interesting because most of the games we've seen have been pretty high in complexity and comprehension. So it seems like, well, I mean, maybe the two are, mostly related. And they are mostly related. But let me give some examples of where they are not. So Scythe is a wonderful example of a game that is relatively low on complexity and relatively low on comprehension, but it's slightly higher complexity. So Scythe is a game where you are essentially, it's sort of area control, resource management. You're doing actions on your board that allow you to do different things and upgrade your character sheet and make it better. But even though it's a slightly heavier game, it's not all that heavy. It's maybe like a medium weight, which some people were a little upset with when this one came out. They were a little disappointed that it wasn't as heavy as it looked. But I think that's really helped by the game's design philosophy. And this is something that Stonemaier is very good about, is making slightly, medium to heavy games that are designed in such a way that their comprehension is very low. It's very easy to teach them. It's very easy to understand the rules. It's very easy to remember the rules if you haven't played the game for a long time. I haven't played this game in forever, and I'm fairly confident I could open it up and maybe reference a couple things in the rulebook and be good to go. But the rulebook's laid out in such a good way that it's relatively simple. But just the way that the game is designed and built, it makes what you do very simple. You do a top action and a bottom action. You can't do the same action on your board twice. You have 4 sections. And so you move your thing on your thing. You do the top one if you want. You do the bottom one if you want. You don't have to do either. Costs are in green. Costs are in red. Benefits are in green as you do things, which makes it super, super, super simple. Similarly, like as you place your mechs on the board, as you build one of your 4 mechs, it reveals an ability that's underneath that mech, and it just makes sense that now you have a mech out there, that ability is also available to all of your mechs. Like, the way the game is designed is so smooth, and there's not really any hiccups. It just works the way you think it would. The fiddliest part of the game is determining like what moves what and what is a combat piece, but even that is delineated between wooden pieces, which are non-combatants, and plastic pieces, which are your mechs and your leader, which are combatants. So there's so many little design things like that. I'm sure I'm forgetting a bunch of them, but where the game is just laid out in such a way that it just clicks with you, and that's what we mean by low comprehension. Right? This is a slightly heavier game. This is not like an entry-level game. This is like a medium-weight game. But it's laid out in such a way that it's easy for people to comprehend. And I think if we cheat a little bit and we add another one to the low comprehension, I would argue that Viticulture is also somewhat low on the comprehension scale, 2.5, somewhere around there. Because it's just one of those games that it's designed in such a way, the board is laid out in such a way that, and all of the text and everything just makes sense. You're not having to look things up in the rulebook. But yeah, that's our first of the low comprehension ones, and that one's a bit of a more interesting one than some of them that we've listed previously. So let's get on to our second one. This is going to be a little bit more normal of a game to say is pretty low comprehension. I think everyone pretty much has played Pandemic. It's a very clean system. You start with a hand of cards that are different cities, and you're trying to get more of those cards in a matching set of colors so that you can cure a disease. Once you cure 4 of the diseases in the base game, then you win. You do not have to eradicate them, but you can. So yeah, you get, 4 actions, I believe, on your turn, and you have a little card that shows all of your actions, because this one would be slightly higher in comprehension, because you have things like, how do you take a direct flight, how do you build a thing, how do you move from point A to point B, but that's all explained on a little card that you can give to every player that says exactly, if you discard a card for the city that you're in, you can go anywhere. If you discard a card for the city you want to go to, you can go to that city. So there's different things like that that would maybe be a little bit higher, but because of the player aids that are in the game, the player references, it makes the game super simple to teach to people. It's really easy to teach. And the board is laid out, again, in such a way that, like, it's pretty obvious. Well, you don't want to get outbreaks because there's a skull at the end of the outbreak track. You lose the game if you get too many outbreaks. Epidemics are bad, and as you're, moving up, like, everything is just laid out really well. Your character abilities are very simple. Definitely a lighter game, but even some of the more, higher comprehension aspects of it are reduced by the fact that there's actually a player reference that answers most questions. So, another great example. And then our last example for lower comprehension, we have Dominion. Another one a lot of people have played. Maybe one people haven't played as much. Valley of the Kings, you've probably heard of us talk about that before, but my personal choice over Dominion would be Valley of the Kings, but more people have played Dominion, so I'm going to use that as the example. Both very similar games with some slight differences. Dominion is obviously what people would call a pure game. We talked about that earlier with Sushi Go. It's a pure deck building game. So you're starting with a very basic deck of simple cards, which are basically just money and a couple of victory points. And you are using that money when it is your turn to buy cards from an offering. And then those cards do different things when you play them. Some of them give you more money. Some of them give you more actions, more card plays, more, all sorts of things. And the goal of the game is to get a bunch of victory points that you'll purchase with money. So you're basically just trying to build like a little engine with your deck in order to purchase these really expensive victory cards. But the victory cards don't do anything. They just kind of clog up your deck, take up your hand. So you have to be careful. You want to make sure your engine's running before you start buying a lot of those, because they're going to take up your hand. But this one would be low comprehension. It's pretty self-explanatory outside of maybe a few questions on like the timings of specific cards. But even then, the rulebook, while sort of an ugly blue color, is pretty well laid out, and it has actual explanations for cards that might be a little bit more trickier. So there is a reference. But on your turn, you're essentially just drawing your cards, playing them, and buying, doing actions, and then it's the next person's turn. So there's not a lot to comprehend. It's very simple and straightforward. Again, not a bad thing, just a fact of the game is it's lower comprehension. So that is 3 high comprehension and 3 low comprehension. Let's move on to the last of the 3 C's, which is consideration. All right, well, we are to the third and final part of the video, which is talking about consideration. If you've made it this long, I'm proud of you. Thanks for sticking with it. Let's talk about 3 games that are high consideration and then 3 more that are lower consideration. So, first one we've got here is Rebellion. Star Wars Rebellion. So this one is basically an asymmetric 2 or 4 player game where one of you is going to play as the Empire and the other as the Rebellion from Star Wars, and it's going to play out very much like the movie. The reason this is super high consideration is because there's, partially because it's so asymmetric, but partially because of just the way the game is designed. It's designed to be very open-ended what you do. The Rebel player is basically trying to keep their Rebel base from being detected by the Empire, and if they're found, they have to try to run to another planet, where the Empire is basically doing various things to subjugate the galaxy and build up their resource generation so they can build bigger and better armies, all while getting these, what they're called, probe cards, like the probe droids from Star Wars, that have different planets. And they're trying to narrow down which planet the Rebel base can be on. And the goal is it's this whole cat and mouse game where you have a track of turns, and so the turn order track moves up one by one, and the Rebels start at a certain point value and are basically trying to move their marker down towards the turn track so that they basically cross, because the sooner the rebels can end the game, the better. And they do that through these mission cards that allow them to go, maybe do some sabotage, maybe have a small skirmish where they kill a couple of units, maybe capturing leaders, different things. And that's where you really get into this high consideration, because there's this whole galaxy in front of you. And as the rebel player especially, you are trying to be very careful. You almost never want to engage in combat because you're so outmatched. This is not a symmetrical game. This is a very asymmetric game. And being so outmatched, you have to be very careful where you allocate your resources, because you don't want to sacrifice any units you have unless you're doing it in order to complete a mission, in order to move that thing down so that you can be closer to winning the game. All while the Empire is bearing down on you and trying their hardest to find where you're hiding and extinguish you. Not only is it an incredible game, but it is a great example of something that is extremely high in consideration. This is a very strategic game. Yes, there's dice rolling when it comes to combat. Yes, there's luck. But the vast majority of it is in how you metagame your opponent. You have to be able to essentially mind read your opponent at times and try to figure out where you think they're trying to check, if they're the Empire, where they're maybe looking for your base, and try to knock them off the scent, get them off of that, and move them towards something else. So you're diverting them from that. And there's a lot of subterfuge. There's so much stuff you can do in this game. And on your turn, there's such a high level of options you have, where you play missions, what missions you go on, where you move your units. If you're the Empire, where you're moving your units in terms of like strategy, being able to scramble in case you do start to figure out where the rebel base is, so you can get a force over there as quickly as possible to try to prevent them from escaping. There's so many decisions to make in this game, on top of the fact that you're also, like I said, almost directly fighting your opponent in terms of like their mental gymnastics and trying to figure out what they're thinking, in order to either, depending on who you are, either find out the rebels or stay away from the Empire. Again, could gush about this game for hours. It's an incredible game. It's incredibly thematic. It's incredibly faithful to Star Wars, the original trilogy, but most importantly, it is incredibly high in terms of your consideration. So that's our first high consideration example. Moving on to our next one, we have a bit of an odd one. So, I mentioned that Codenames would be coming up again. We ranked this game high, or rather low in terms of complexity, because it's a relatively simple game. But what makes it so fun for people who are inexperienced gamers and who are seasoned gamers is that there is a lot to consider on your turn, specifically as the Spy Master, but also as the people doing the guessing. As the Spy Master, yes, all you have to come up with is a word and a number of things that word relates to on the board. And there's not even that many rules about what your clue can be in terms of your word. It basically can't be something on the board. You can choose whether or not to allow proper nouns, things like that. There are some other small rules, but for the most part, you're picking a word and you're saying how many things it relates to. But where the consideration comes in is you have to consider not only are your teammates going to be able to guess what it is you're trying to get them to go for. So in terms of if you say, something that they could potentially either uncover an opponent's piece or an innocent bystander, which basically just ends your turn, which is slightly better than getting an opponent's piece, because if you get an opponent's piece, then they actually just score the point and your turn ends. So not only do you get to not continue, but you just scored the other team a point. So you have to be very careful about what you say, but there's also the assassin space, which can just immediately end the game if your team accidentally picks it and automatically win it for the other team that didn't pick the assassin. There's so many choices to make, and when you're in the hot seat, it can feel just it's really intense when you're in that hot seat, trying to come up with a thing to connect as many things as possible and be efficient, because the game is all about being efficient. You could give one word that relates to one card every turn, but you're likely going to lose because all your opponent needs to do is once get 2 cards say one word and relate it to 2 cards and have their team guess properly. So high in consideration, low in complexity, and that's why we picked this game a second time. Most of them have been unique so far, but this one was on here a second time specifically because it's a good example of a game that packs a lot of consideration into a very streamlined and not complex package. So that's the second one. So for our third one here, we have Xia Legends of a Drift System. This one is a great example because it is a sandbox style game. You could have also put Western Legends here if you're familiar with that. It's a very similar game. There are differences, and we may do a video on that down the road. My personal favorite is Xia, so I chose this one. Western Legends maybe is a little bit more well known. I don't know. Point being, it's a sandbox game, which is why we chose it for this consideration. Automatically, that means extremely high consideration, because you quite literally can do almost anything in this game. You start out with a very small map with a couple of planets and maybe some asteroids, and you can explore, you can upgrade your ship, you can get money by doing missions or by mining and then selling the ore or whatever the resource is that you collect. You can do, you can become an outlaw, you can become a good guy, an enforcer. You can do all sorts of things. There's NPCs that are flying around. You can interact with those. You can, like I said, you can do all sorts of different types of missions. So there's some of them are just delivery, some of them are good, some of them are like assassination missions, and they're evil, and then they get bounties on you. So you can go hunt other players who have bounties because, hey, they're an outlaw, and if you kill them, you get their bounty. There's so many things going on. There's so many things that score you victory points. There's literally a card in the game that gives you just a whole list of things that can score you victory points. And so you are trying to fly around and do those as efficiently as possible to become the greatest legend in the drift system. What makes this high consideration should be pretty obvious. You have so many options available, so many actions, so many things you can do on your turn. You're almost not limited at all. Really, the only limiting factor is how much fuel you have, so how far you can get. And then if you do a non, I forget what it's called, but there's major actions and then some minor ones. I think it's actually just called minor. You can do as many minor actions as you want, but then once you do a major action, you can't move anymore. So that's really the only restriction, but you can plan out your whole turn, figure out I'm going to go here, and then I can go over here in order to complete this mission because I need to go from this planet to this planet. And on top of that, what even adds the high consideration is the fact that when it's not your turn, your teammates may be revealing tiles and things that you need in order to complete missions. Because if the planet isn't out yet that you need to complete a mission, you gotta wait until it's out. And then once it's out, you can go fly over there. Super fun game. But the reason it's on the list for that high consideration is because of the fact that it's a sandbox game. So we wanted to, use that as a good example. So that is the third of our high consideration, almost said complexity, consideration games. Let's do 3 slightly lower consideration games. So we have, first off, our running joke of including Chrononauts in every single video we do. Super underrated little card game, which we've talked about before, but it is essentially a giant grid of cards that are each different years. And you are a time traveler. Your goal is basically to get certain events flipped over to alternate history versions or patch them with even more alternate history versions, and do that before your opponents succeed in their goal. Very simple. There's a surprising amount of strategy and things in it, but that's not what we're here to talk about. In terms of consideration, there's very little you do on your turn. You have your small hand of cards, and you draw a card, and you play a card. It's the same thing as a game like Flux. It works very well, but it's incredibly simple. There's not a lot to consider. You have maybe 3, 4, 5 cards in your hand, and you're drawing an additional one, choosing from the ones you have, playing one of those, and that's your turn. Your turn moves on. So super low in terms of consideration. There's not a lot to consider on your turn other than trying to get to your objectives. There's not just a ton of different paths to go down with Xia. So our second low consideration game is Ticket to Ride. This is obviously a classic board game that a lot of people have played. If you're not familiar, you basically have a board which has a bunch of different connections via train that are different lengths and they're different colors. And you're going to have these route cards that you're trying to complete for different amounts of victory points. The longer the route, the more victory points you get. But on your turn, the reason this is low consideration is there's really not a whole lot you do. You either take more train cars, so similar to something like Splendor, you're getting like the resources and you're trying to get a bunch of the same color train cars, or you spend your train cars in order to build a route, so you have to have the right color and the right quantity in order to build on the route. And then you can get new routes, and that's pretty much the whole game, is you're just trying to build those different routes, and you're getting cards in order to do that, discarding them to build those routes. So not a lot to consider on your turn, other than which routes you're trying to go for, and making sure that you're not getting blocked by other people, because people can build in such a way that they can actually interrupt your routes and things like that. So super low consideration on a turn-to-turn basis, relatively simple in the strategy department, not a lot to think about and work around. Okay, and last but not least, our last low consideration game is one that has surprised me in how much I like it, which is Quacks of Quedlinburg. This game, like I said, took me by surprise. It's a bag building game, and it's extremely luck based, but it's a ton of fun, and it's also very low consideration. The round structure works like this. You have a bunch of chips of different colors and different numerical values in your bag. You'll start with a bunch of white ones and a couple of different kinds. On your turn, you're either taking a chip out and placing it in your cauldron, or you're choosing to stop. And the only reason you're going to stop is because you're getting close to exploding your cauldron if you have too many white pieces. So if you have white pieces that have numbers that total up to greater than 7. So if you're at 7, you're perfectly fine, but if you're greater than 7, your cauldron explodes and you miss out on some points. It's not the end of the world, but you definitely, it's less efficient for your overall strategy. So there's not a lot to consider. You draw a chip out, you put it down. If you're getting close to exploding your cauldron, you may choose to not draw any more chips, or you may still choose to draw chips, but that's pretty much your decision, is do I draw another chip or do I stay where I am at? Low consideration. Not a lot to consider there. The most consideration that you'd be doing in this game is after you do all that, you score victory points and things, and then you have a certain amount of currency that you got for how far you got along in your cauldron that allows you to buy new chips to put in your bag to essentially dilute your bag, so there's more good chips and less white chips, because the white chips are bad. And even that, there's not a ton of decisions to make because the chips are relatively expensive and you can't buy a whole bunch of them. So you can buy maybe one or two, especially starting out in the beginning of the game. You can't buy a whole lot. Well, by the end, when you actually do have a decent amount of money, you pretty much know the strategy you're going for and you've already decided your chips. So there's still very low consideration. Highly recommend the game. It's actually a ton of fun for how swingy and random it is. And there's a good catch-up mechanic and everything. But very low consideration is what we're talking about, and this definitely fits the bill. So that was, 18 examples of both high and low for each category of game in the 3 Cs. So hopefully that helps people understand where we're coming from when we talk about that. Again, just to reiterate, the 3 Cs are not a review system. They're not a ranking or a rating or a good or a bad. They are simply to help people decide if a game is good for them or bad for them based on those metrics that we laid out. If you like games where there's a lot to ponder and consider between turns and during your turn, and there's all these different choices you have, then you're going to want to lean towards things that are high consideration. If you like games that are very low in complexity, there's not a lot of different mechanics, they're simple, they're straightforward, there's not different mechanics sort of working together or being integrated together, you're going to want to go for low complexity games. And that's the whole point of listing these. We'll give our personal scores and reviews, but the 3 Cs are supposed to be as objective as possible. There's always going to be some bias, especially because we're more experienced gamers, so we may tend to rank things, lower complexity than they really are. We'll try not to do that, but that's always a possibility just because we play more games, so we may have we have enough understanding, we've played enough games that we may rank things a little bit lower or higher than they maybe should be if you're a brand new gamer. But the idea is to help people who aren't familiar with a game decide if a game is right for them. And that's really all it's for. So hopefully this helped. Hopefully, let us know if you buy any of these games based on this metric, because we think it's kind of a neat system, but of course we would because we made it. Please remember to like and subscribe, and happy gaming.